We have so many stories in our lives, but our stories are not always heard. On the Hear My True Story podcast, we tell our own true stories.
Before the white car parked, our head teacher had scattered. Looking at him, I could only see his tie that was flying backwards, waving at us, and he disappeared in thin air.
I want to share my life story. I want to share my voice with the people because I know that just a small joke I can tell through this podcast, it will make someone smile.
When you ask me what I fear most in life, I would definitely respond to you and say it's fear itself.
We are fighting for togetherness. We are fighting for equal rights. We are fighting to end injustice.
You don't have to be a storyteller or writer because, guess what? Life writes the best stories.
Hear my true story.
Since my arrival in Germany, I have been asking myself the same question. When can I truly consider myself integrated into the German system or maybe into the German society? Personally, I am still struggling with this same question. Honestly, I don't have a clear answer yet. It feels like I'm trying to figure out a puzzle.
This is your favorite time of the week with your number one podcast.
Hear my true story.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Hear My True Story podcast. I am your host, Otako. And I am thrilled to have you join me again this wonderful week. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude for your continuous support to the podcast, Hear My True Story. It means a lot every week when you tune in to listen to our wonderful experiences, narratives, and stories. As we step into the month of February, you know what, my dear listeners? It holds a special significance as it is the Black History Month. So, on our podcast, Hear My True Story, we are starting this month with a series of personal narratives from individuals of African descent living here in Germany. These stories will dive into their experiences, their lives, and what it really means for them to integrate into the German system. So, at Hear My True Story podcast, our focus is on sharing personal stories and hearing first-hand experiences. Before we dive into today's episode, let me take a moment to share a wonderful experience of my own.
With you every week. Hear my true story.
Oh, my dear listeners. Since my arrival in Germany, I have been asking myself the same question. When can I truly consider myself integrated into the German system or maybe into the German society? Personally, I am still struggling with this same question. Honestly, I don't have a clear answer yet. It feels like I'm trying to figure out a puzzle. Once I had a conversation with a friend of mine from East Africa who lives in Germany. We were both wondering, when do we feel like we belong into the German society? Maybe when we feel like we are really integrated into the German society. So I went online and searched, when do I fully understand that I'm part of the German society? I mean, when do I fully understand that I am integrated into the German society? So, upon my arrival here in Germany, as a volunteer from Uganda, I had to take some steps into the integration process here in Germany. You see, I want to give you a little background, perhaps to understand well, as an immigrant coming from an East African country, in my experience, what I needed to do as a person and what was required from me. Before you leave Uganda to come to Germany as a volunteer, you need to have a certain level of the German language. It is a B1 level that was required. So I studied up to B1 in Uganda. But when I reached Germany, I realized my B1 level was not enough. I could only say basic things like greetings and asking for water and saying thank you. So instead of waiting for someone to tell me what to do, I decided I needed to learn German better to understand what's happening around me. So I started learning German from the basics, from A1 to B1 and B2. It wasn't easy, especially something like for someone like me coming from another country where we speak another language. It is not easy to learn a new language. Now in 2024, I can speak, write, and understand German. I may not speak as well as someone born and raised here in Germany, but I can communicate. That's what I know. But here's the thing. Learning German is not easy for immigrants. Some people may think that we don't want to learn, but it's not that simple. German classes are expensive and not everyone gets the support from the government. For me, I had an opportunity because I was a volunteer. I had to have A1, A2, and B1 offered because of my volunteer service. I learned that. I went in classes for that and I had nothing to pay for that. I didn't pay for that. But for me, to get B2 and C1, I had to pay, and it's expensive. I had to pay around €1,000 for each level of German. And that was just for classes, not counting exams. That's if you need to get a certificate that proves that you went into that B2 and you studied it and you passed it, and you went to C1 and you studied it and you passed it. And maybe if you want C2, you do the same.
Enjoying this episode? Leave a review now.
Hear my true story.
But it doesn't end with language. That's what it is. To find a job here, you often need a specific training. As someone who wanted to work with young people and children, me personally, I needed a training in that area. Finding the right training was tough for me. And many schools required a high level of German. All schools I approached, they required a C1 level. So I had to take classes for C1. And passing C1 was not easy. Personally, I failed it many times. And repeated, I failed it and I repeated, I failed and I repeated it again until when I passed and got C1 level. Even after learning the language and getting the certificate of C1 level and getting into the training which I'm doing right now as a pre-educator, the question of full integration remains. I am closely to finishing my training as an educator here in Germany, but I still wonder if I am fully integrated into the system. As I share my story on the podcast, hear my true story, I want listeners to think about what it really means to be fully integrated. Is it about the language? Or is it about finding a training or going to the university and studying a bachelor's or a master's, or is it something else? For me, the journey continues, and I'm still figuring out what it truly means to be fully integrated into Germany. Fully integrated into the German society. What it means. And when should I say that I'm fully integrated into the German society? And when should I say that I'm fully integrated into the German society? So, my dear listeners, this same question up to date is still coming back to me. When do I really, really say that I'm truly, and I consider myself, integrated into the German society? Those who are listening right now on Hear My True Story podcast, and perhaps you can share with us that, well, someone can say that I'm fully integrated into any society if they can meet these certain things. You can let us know. You can write us an email, our email here at hearmytruestory.com. We shall be happy to hear from you. Also, you can find the email on the description of the podcast. And for those who are trying to get into the Germany society, to get into the integration, well, you are not alone. We are many, just like me. I shared with you my experience. And my dear listeners, I want to tell you something. Thank you for supporting Hear My True Story podcast. And I'm really pleasured to have you every week that you tune in. As it is the Black History Month in February, we look forward to your engagement in this series that we are sharing. Leaving a comment, subscribing, telling a friend about this wonderful podcast. If you have anything that you want to share with us on the podcast, well, reach us on our email here at hearmytruestory.com, and we shall be happy to invite you, have you as a guest on Hear My True Story podcast. Thank you for always listening to Hear My True Story podcast. It has been me, your host, Otako.
We not only have voices for a podcast, but also faces for YouTube. Don't miss your next episode. Hear My True Story.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Music by Edwin Matovo, hosted and produced by Otako. Subscribe to our podcast for more stories and visit us on our website, hearmytruestory.com, for more stories. All the links are listed in the show notes of this podcast.